Introducing Danny Tuscho. Copyright 2014. Written by Brad Engel. All rights reserved. Dedication. This book is dedicated to my wife Jackie, who has been my partner and biggest supporter for many years. My love for her is stronger and deeper than she will ever know. I also dedicate this book to my mother, Jane Engel, whose character and faith in me will never be forgotten. I miss her very much. Chapter 1. This is who we are. Danny Tuscho takes a deep breath and looks down at his guitar. He's come a long way in the past few years, and it has a lot to do with the instrument in his hands. From scared and angry and volatile to composed and aware and relaxed. Well, as relaxed as he can be when he's preparing to go on stage. Every year, Giant Hills Middle School holds a musical talent show called the Extravaganza. Kids from every grade are encouraged to participate, and winners are recognized from each level with a grand champion selected from all of the participants. The competition began as a small exhibition of a few students thrown together by one caring music teacher and has grown into a major event complete with television cameras and local celebrity judges. Students show off their musical abilities in whatever format they wish, whether singing, playing an instrument, or a combination of both. Some participants play original music, and others play covers of popular hits. It's all allowed, just so long as the student is the one making the music. Danny flexes his fingers and wonders where all the stiffness has come from. A few moments ago, he would have said that everything was fine. Now his hands feel like they're slowly filling with sand, and his stomach is turning in a circle. He shakes his fingers and takes a breath. In a moment, he will be back on stage. Lights in his eyes, crowd stretching out before him, silence and music, and the pounding of blood in his ears. It seems like it was only a short time ago he was standing in front of this same crowd for the first time. The memory makes his heart quicken and his skin crawl. He shivers under a cold breeze only he can feel and tries to push the recollection of that night out of his mind. It was an event he wishes he could forget, but standing backstage, listening to the performer before him, part of Danny is glad for the experience. He knows what is about to happen. He remembers the sensations and the emotions and how he had responded. Tonight is different, he tells himself. Many of the students will have remembered last year, and like so many 14-year-olds, the opinion of his peers means a great deal to Danny. He wants to be liked. He wants people to think he is cool. Danny pushes a hand through his messy hair. He grabs a handful and gives it a few short tugs, trying to distract himself from his surroundings. The sound of the crowds waft through the backstage area and fill Danny's ears. The spectators cheer one performer and welcome another. Danny fingers the guitar and does a few warm-up exercises. His hands still feel like they are worthless, and he's starting to get convinced that this was a terrible idea. Why did he have to do this? What made him think this would be any better than last year? The guitar suddenly begins to feel heavy, and the weight of it cuts a rut in Danny's shoulder. He shifts uncomfortably and looks about the room. All around him, students are pacing, mumbling, humming, or just sitting there in silence. His stomach begins another slow revolution, and Danny sucks a long stream of air up his nose. He closes his eyes, lays his hands on the guitar, and lets his breath seep out a narrow opening between his lips. The nerves are getting harder to overcome. When Danny opens his eyes, a boy across the room catches his eye. The kid must be in the 6th grade based on how small he looked next to the 8th graders sitting behind him. The boy was holding a trumpet, and his fingers were shaking so bad he couldn't depress any of the valves, and the sweat on his forehead was running freely down his face. Danny couldn't help but feel bad for the kid. The sand in his own hands began to drain off. Danny crossed the room slowly, picking his way between the nervous bodies and stacks of instruments. His fingers stretched and danced across the fretboard more easily, and Danny felt his confidence begin to rise. "Hey," he quietly called once he was close to the trumpet player. The kid looked up at him, dropped his eyes to Danny's guitar, then looked at his own knees without a word. "How the butterflies?" Danny asked. The boy just sat there, keeping his eyes low and his mouth shut. "I remember my first year," Danny continued. "I thought I was going to puke on my shoes. I was pretty sure I would have to go out on stage smelling like vomit." The boy scowled, but didn't look up. "Not to mention all of my fears about forgetting my song, or falling, or passing out, or... Is this supposed to make me feel better?" the boy finally asked. His head was still low, and he obstinately refused to look up at Danny, but his eyes were searching all over the floor. "No, I guess not," Danny admitted. "It just looked like you were nervous, that's all." "So you decided to make it better by reminding me of all the worst things that could happen?" the boy asked in a cutting tone. "Oh no," Danny said in a loud voice. "There are so many things that are worse than those." The boy looked at Danny out of the corner of his eye. "A light could come loose and fall on you, cracking your head open," Danny suggested, and the boy smiled in horror. "Or you could be attacked by a wild goose. How about if you walked out on stage, tripped over a cord, knocked down a table with a glass of water that spilled on some electrical work, causing a fire and burning the entire building down?" The boy chuckled darkly and said, "What if all the people in the audience got up and threw ninja stars at me until I fell over dead?" "Gross dude," Danny replied. "But yeah, that would be worse than a little puke." "What's your name?" "Tyler," the boy answered. "Danny," the elder said. "Nice to meet you. What song are you going to play?" "Amazing Grace." "Nice. You'll do fine, by the way. I know this because I will be in the audience, and I didn't bring any ninja stars with me." "Someone will loan you one, I'm sure," Tyler replied with a smile. "How about you?" Danny answered. "What song are you playing?" "Oh, well, that's kind of a surprise." "Come on, man," the boy persisted. "What is it?" "Well, you'll just have to wait and see. But I'm certain you haven't heard it before." "You wrote it?" "Something like that," Danny answered evasively. Tyler hummed disappointingly at Danny and returned to staring at his knees. "I'm gonna suck," he confessed. "I'm so nervous I don't think I'll be able to stand the whole time." Danny plucked at his guitar and hoped he didn't chicken out on his own song. "Have you played every year?" Tyler asked. "Nah," Danny answered, still plucking away at the strings of his instrument. "This is my 2nd year." "And last year, did you finish your song?" Danny looked up at Tyler and made a face. "Dang," the boy replied, "this is gonna suck." "You're gonna be fine," Danny said. "Dude, I'm not." Danny leaned in and asked for Tyler's undivided attention. "You're the only one out there," he began. "It's just you playing your song and doing your best. You may mess up. You may screw the whole thing up. That's okay. Really. You just have to go out there and do your best is all. Look at me. Last year was horrible. But here I am. Now you might be stupid though, the boy pointed out. Danny laughed in spite of himself. Yeah, he admitted, could be. But I also could be proof that you can survive anything. You're going to do fine. The boy fingered the valves on his horn and smiled. You suck at this. At what? Making people feel not nervous. I think I feel worse. That was my goal, Danny said with a grin. I saw you and thought you might be better than me, so I was going to come over here and make you feel awful. Then you would really do bad, and I would beat you. Tyler laughed and shook his head at Danny. Whatever, man. Danny Tuscho, called a voice from the stage door. Danny waved and turned to go on stage. Good luck, man, he said as he left. Danny, the boy called. Danny turned around and said, Yeah? Good luck. I really do feel better. Dang, he replied darkly, then smiled. The boy laughed, and Danny walked out to the assistant who had called his name. Danny, the assistant asked. Yep, he said in a suddenly unsteady voice. You're next. Ready? Danny took a deep breath. Absolutely, he declared, and walked out onto the stage. Chapter 2. If the world was turned upside down, then everything would be just right. Getting out of bed was merely a formality. Danny Tuscho had woken early to watch nearly an hour tick by on his bedside clock, the pattering of raindrops keeping time on the window pane. He was much like any other 12-year-old who was about to attend a new school. He went to bed excited to finally be in middle school, but woke up anxious about not knowing anyone or anything about Giant Hills Middle School. Off and on, Danny had tossed and turned during the night, and eventually he just gave up on sleep altogether. When the alarm finally did go off, he tossed the blankets and slid out of the bed. Danny made his way to the closet mirror and took a long look at the boy in the reflection. Average height, a little skinny, shaggy hair. Nothing special, Danny said to himself. He then moved to look out the window. Raising the blinds, Danny found a gray scene of overcast and murky water collecting in the gutters. Appraising the view, he let his eyes roll back into his head. Perfect, he sighs. A voice floats down the stairs and into his room, calling his name. Are you up? It asks. Yes, Mom, he replies with a hint of a tone. She had been telling Danny for weeks that everything would be fine. It will be a new school for all the other sixth graders as well. Remember, his mother had said, earnestly trying to comfort her son. Except they will all still have their friends, and I won't. The conversation had started and ended that way a dozen times during the summer. His mother was sure Danny would be fine, and Danny refused to acknowledge a silver lining. Digging through his dresser, Danny tries to pretend that he hasn't been thinking about what he would wear his first day at Giant Hills. He lifts a pair of slim black jeans and assesses them as if someone were watching, then tosses them onto the bed. He then grabs his favorite shirt, the black one, with a gaping skull and "Bullet for my Valentine" written above it. He slips on his sneakers and again looks at himself in the mirror. Nothing special. At the breakfast table, Danny swirled his spoon around the cereal bowl, his head planted firmly in his other palm. Big day, his father offered while sipping a cup of coffee. Danny just looked at him and sighed dramatically. As if the response was sufficient, his father went back to looking at his phone and sipping on his coffee. Danny let his gaze fade to the window. He could see across the street, though the sheets of rain made it hard to discern many details. In the early morning light, with droplets speckling the front window, the houses across the street almost looked like Richard's. Richard and Danny had been thick as thieves since the first grade, when Danny's parents had bought a house across the street from Richard's family. The boys became best friends almost overnight. By the 5th grade, the boys had started to come into their own, and with only a few rare exceptions, they really didn't spend time with anyone else. To them, that was fine. They just got used to being the outsiders. Last winter, Danny began to hear his parents complaining about bills more often than usual. They kept mentioning something about interest rates, credit cards, and mortgage something or other. Danny understood as much as someone who was 12 could. They were running out of money. By the summer, they had to find a new house, which meant a new neighborhood, a new school, and no more Richard. Danny was angry with his parents, especially his father, but what could he do? When the day came that they packed their things and loaded the truck, Danny gave his only real friend a smack on the arm and told him he'd see him on the internet. And then he was gone. Trying to distract himself, Danny picked up his schedule and read it again. It listed his topics, times, and locations: math, English, science, history, PE, and art, which were also known as headaches, writing a bunch, burning things, dead people, and running and coloring. He let his head drop onto the table. "No time for sleep now, mister," his mother announced. "Bus'll be here any minute." 7:30. True enough. His mother watched him gather his jacket and bag, then gave him a big hug. She worked as a nurse and had chosen the career to give her the flexibility of being home in the mornings. Danny was always such a good kid in her mind, and she struggled seeing him so depressed. It was the reason she opposed the move, but the economic realities of the situation could not be ignored. They were facing foreclosure, and it was move or be moved. She squeezed her son again and wished him good luck. "I'm sure you'll be fine, Danny," his father said, trying to sound reassuring. He was dealing with his own levels of guilt, having uprooted his family, but Mr. Tuscho would stubbornly stand behind his decision. Bankruptcy and foreclosure would kill his chances to try home ownership again anytime soon. In his mind, this was just an unavoidable decision that would result in later happiness. Danny walked out the door of his new home to begin his new life in his new school. They had just moved in last week, and he had spent most of the past 6 days unpacking. He looked around a neighborhood he didn't know, pulled his hood down low over his eyes to keep out the rain, and adjusted the bag on his shoulders. With a resolved sigh, Danny stepped off the front porch and headed to the street and to the bus stop. He was fighting feelings of being homesick for his old life, his old school, and his old friends. Feet splashing in the street, water splatting on his hood, he couldn't recall having ever been quite so miserable. Chapter 3. First Impressions. Through the rain, Danny squinted to find the bus stop 2 blocks away. It was on the corner of a busy street at the entrance to the Giant Woods neighborhood. A few cars splashed by as he sloshed along. Still a ways off, the sound of a diesel engine could be heard over the hill. Danny looked up in time to see the bus pulling to a stop, lights flashing and brakes squealing. He muttered angrily and ran to catch his ride before it left him. Panting and calling for the driver to wait, Danny arrived in time to bang on the side of the bus as the doors opened. Hustling to the reopened doors, he slipped on the curb and buried his shoe in a deep puddle. Water flooded onto his sneaker, and he tips his head back in frustration. Kids on the bus are laughing at the boy who almost got left behind and is now the proud owner of one soaked pant leg. Trying to salvage his pride, Danny slowly mounts the steps and navigates the main aisle with his eyes on the floor. He took the first seat he could find near the front of the bus and stared straight ahead, not daring to look around. His stomach twitched as he heard whispering behind him. He couldn't imagine them talking about anything else but his clumsy performance. The door drew closed and the bus shook forward. It was noisy and full of typical early adolescent conversations. Boys loudly boasted and girls giggled. There were hollers and shrieks. Someone was smacking a seat back and it sounded like a bag was being tossed about. Danny wanted to turn around and look at the bus crowd, but he didn't want to draw attention to himself. He had hoped to see someone like him. Danny didn't entertain any foolish fantasies about finding someone as cool as Richard was, but meeting someone who didn't suck didn't seem like too much to ask. Reluctantly obeying his desire, Danny turned and looked at the mass of students behind him. For a moment, it was like watching TV, like Danny was nothing more than a viewer and not a participant. Everyone seemed to be talking to someone else. Everyone had a friend that they were laughing with or arguing with, and no one seemed to notice that he was alive. Slowly, Danny turned back to face the front and saw a pair of eyes peeking over the seat back in front of him. "Bullet for my Valentine?" the voice asked. Danny looked at his chest and saw the logo creeping up from behind his coat zipper. "Yeah," he replied skeptically. The eyes squinted in a smile, and Danny heard derisive laughing as they disappeared again on the other side of the seat. "Oh, just get me off this bus," Danny pined silently. Mercifully, he found himself not waiting long before pulling into the parking lot bus loop. Without direction, most of the kids stood up and started to move forward while the bus found its parking spot. Danny sat there, hesitant to get up, but not wanting to appear too different. The driver grabbed the microphone and addressed the bus. "Please remain seated until the bus comes to a full and complete stop." He said it in a tone which implied the hope of compliance, but not the expectation of it. The kids continued to push and jockey for position as if the announcement had never been made. Danny remained where he was, waiting for an opening in the crowd. It was mass confusion for several moments until Danny saw an opportunity and stepped out into the aisle. Being jostled and bumped at every step, he made his way up the walkway. At the top of the stairs, someone stepped on Danny's pant leg while pushing him from behind. Danny reached to brace himself on a handrail, but couldn't find a good grip and spun out of the bus door. He landed hard on his shoulder, slamming it into the pavement. "Careful!" the bus driver yelled down at him. Danny examined the puddle in which he currently found himself resting, then looked up to see all eyes staring at him, mouths hanging open after having been witness to his unplanned acrobatics. Simultaneously, they all started laughing. Some had the decency to cover their laughs with a hand, but most openly roared their enjoyment and pointed at the new kid in the puddle. "Hey, Peter, did you see that?" asked the boy standing close by. "Oh, my God," he continued, "that was the stupidest thing I have ever seen." "Nah," Billy said, "that was awesome." The two boys began laughing again. "Hey," Billy said, while Danny struggled to exit the puddle without getting even more soaked. "Need some help?" "No," Danny replied uncertainly. I'm good. Shut up, the boy responded and extended a hand. Here! Warily, Danny reached out. The boy grabbed Danny's arm, and just as he was about to lift him up, he let go, and Danny crashed back into the water. Oops, Billy laughed as Danny spat out more water. Peter and Billy walked off, continuing their revelry as Danny sat in the puddle. A group of girls walked by and giggled at the sight of him. Danny waited until they were gone, collected himself, and then climbed out of the water. You okay? The bus driver asked. No, Danny responded, walking off in the direction of the other kids. He marched toward the school to the murmur of laughing children, all pointing at his soaked pants and jacket. He was so mortified he wished for invisibility. If only he could hit some kind of rewind button and go back in time about 10 minutes and never have gotten on that bus. Chapter 4. Welcome to the bottom of the barrel. Danny rubs at his shoulder, trying to knead the pain away. He doesn't want to let on how much it hurt to fall out of the bus. At first, he was shocked and not feeling much more than embarrassment. Even after that Billy kid had dropped him, he still wasn't feeling any real pain. Once he got up, though, the soreness began to sink in. So, he bit at his lip. He stood as straight as he could. Danny kept his head up and tried not to make any whimpering noises as he flowed into the mob of students. The thing about middle school, as Danny would soon find out, is that there is a snowball effect. And when things go bad, they can inexplicably continue in a downward spiral for no apparent reason. That was how this day was going so far. But this was no ordinary day. This was Danny's first day of middle school, and he was the new kid. But it certainly had been, at the very least, a bad way to start the year. Another thing about middle schoolers, they are always looking and judging as to how their peers react to social situations. Those who are able to slough off embarrassing moments like the one Danny had just endured, and who can rise above the moment, so to speak, tend to increase their stature in the hierarchy of the social stratosphere to quickly gain the respect of their peers. It's all about how you react under pressure. That is the key to success in middle school. That is the key to survival. It is kind of like being in the spotlight, and since this would be the age of adolescent egocentrism, the spotlight is shining brightly, and a cool persona could potentially carry one through a difficult situation. Danny had none of these skills. He was unable to recover. He really was quite awkward, and socially had a hard time when the spotlight was on him. When the pressure was on, he folded under the weight of the crowd and silently endured the ridicule of his clumsy departure from the bus. He had failed, not because he had fallen off the bus, but because reaction to the fall hadn't passed the muster of his peers. In other words, Danny was in trouble, and he knew it. He also knew from watching movies on TV that above all else, he had to be cool in his actions and his words. That can be pretty difficult when you are paralyzed with fear, unsure about anything you might say or do. And since he had already performed a little bit of acrobatics and tumbled off the bus, to the bemusement of many, his confidence level dropped to a new low. Over the summer, he'd put quite a bit of preparation into what would be his first appearance at his new school. He spent many hours in front of the mirror trying new hairstyles, trying to determine which clothes would look the best. He would never admit this to anyone, but he really cared about what he looked like, though he was trying to create an I don't care what I look like look. Over the summer, he even practiced his best lines until they sounded smooth and natural. He practiced them over and over in his mind and was always looking for something that someone else had said that he could add to his repertoire. He even developed what he thought was a cool way to walk, kind of dragging his left foot as he walked down the hallway of his house. His mother had thought he had sprained his ankle and wanted to take him for an x-ray. But the difficulty with Danny was that he didn't have the people skills at this point in his life. He didn't know how to meet people, and he surely didn't know how to make friends. At his old school, he certainly was never the most popular kid in his grade, but he had never been in a position like this. In his old neighborhood, he had been there since the first grade, so everybody knew him. And he'd had his share of friends, Richard, Charlie, Andrew. They were all his friends, and he kept busy most days with them, so he never even thought about making new friends. He was content. He looked around, and Danny was ashamed of how he felt. These kids didn't know him. They had no idea what his past looked like, what mistakes he has made, or if he was a loser or a hero. Today was a clean slate, a blank canvas, and now it was a new canvas that had been dunked in a parking lot puddle. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part wasn't the humiliating himself in front of the crowd part. The worst part wasn't being teased and dropped back in the puddle. The worst part wasn't the stares or even the lack of companionship, though he thought a friend would be really cool right about now. The worst part was that he cared. Danny genuinely cared what the other kids thought of him. He honestly wanted to be liked and admired by the kids with whom he shared the halls. Despite the dark clothes and the reclusive attitude, Danny wanted there to be someone present that thought he was worthwhile. And that was terrible. He sloshed through the hall, weaving his way to his first period class, trying to ignore the fact that no one was talking to him. No one was acknowledging his presence, further than to chuckle at him as his wet shoes squished by. And no one looked like him. Standing in pockets and cliques, the children of Giant Hills Middle School seemed to be a living museum of the modern average American preteen. You had the sports junkies wearing basketball jerseys over t-shirts and coats parading the logo of their favorite pro sports team. There were the sparkle girls with the glitter and sequins and all those ridiculous hair accessories that sprout pink curls of fabric. Danny spotted the snobs easily. They were all dressed like mannequins from a catalog. They seemed to be color-coded as a group, sticking to grays and blues. One of the boys had hair that was fixed so it was basically standing straight up, like some glittery vampire. And Danny wondered if he meant to look like that or if it was by accident. As he went down the hall, Danny spotted the hipsters, the nerds, the artists, and the thugs. Could this be an entire school of kids who are nothing like me? During the summer, he had entertained the fear that upon arriving at his school, Danny would be immediately ostracized. He feared being labeled, branded, and put on a shelf, never to be acknowledged again. So Danny had given it some serious thought. His plan was to identify a group of similarly minded persons and quickly attach himself to them. He'd have to find the kids who liked good music, and by good he meant heavy metal, who weren't loud and obnoxious and didn't like to pick fights. He would then present himself as if he were the most popular kid from his old school, so they would think he was awesome and immediately want him to be part of their group. Yesterday, the plan seemed foolproof. Now, looking down the halls of the middle school, that same plan seemed to be deteriorating around him. At his old school, Danny was certainly never the most popular of kids. There were the stars like at every school, and Danny blended nicely with the rest of the mob. He had a close group of friends, including Richard, Charlie, Michael, and Ben. But he had been at that school since the first grade. Everybody knew him. He never had to search for the kids like him, because for 5 years, he had found his identity right alongside the rest of his friends. He was never the weird one, just one in a group of weird ones. And that was good enough for him. The simple questions like, who will I sit by in class? Who will walk with me? who'll I have lunch with were all non-issues last year. Now, faced with the prospect of being alone all day, Danny began to revisit his anger with his father. If only his father made more money. If only he had been more careful. If only his father had found a house in the old neighborhood. If only he had kept Danny closer to his friends. The thoughts danced through Danny's head until the frustrations made him ready to run away from home. Then he looked up and found that he was completely lost. His parents had taken him to the school last week to help him get oriented. Mr. Giro, the school counselor, was polite and told him he thought that Danny would just love middle school here at Giant Hills. Danny should have known better than to believe him. Mr. Giro showed Danny and his parents around the school, pointing out where the new computer lab was, the gym, the auditorium, the cafeteria, and where his locker was located. The school was only a few years old, and everything seemed shiny and new. Danny had received his schedule of classes that day, and he and his parents walked around the school, finding where all his classes were located. His father had insisted that Danny should find the rooms on his own, from the directions Mr. Giro had given. But today, hallways filled with noisy children and stressed-out teachers, everything looked different. In no time, Danny was completely disoriented. He looked around for room numbers as he tried to find his first period American history class. The 5-minute bell sounded and the crowds in the hall began to dissipate. He began to panic a little. He had no idea if he was in the right area, hall, or even the right wing of the school. He realized that he had just been walking for walking's sake and had cared more about finding kids like him than finding his class. What was there to worry about, right? He had done this last week, right? Well, now he found himself quickly pacing up and down the same hall, reading numbers but not able to find where his class was being held. A teacher went to pass him by, another example of someone not paying him any mind. And Danny flagged her down. He showed her his schedule, and she gave him an irritated look, one that said, "Kid, can't you see I'm running late?" Her voice was softer than her look when she told him to go back to the main foyer, then turn left, go up the stairs, turn left again, and his class would be down the hall on the right. This was the upstairs class? Danny could have sworn that this was his math class. Confused and worried that he was being given poor instructions, Danny just stood there with a confused expression. The teacher looked down at him like he was simple and barked, "Young man, you have 2 minutes before the tardy bell rings. You need to get moving." With that, she trotted off down the hall, her modest heels clacking on the linoleum floor as she went. For another moment he stood in the hall, studying the class schedule. Then his memory clicked. He was in the math hall right now. The teacher was right. History was upstairs. Danny gripped his bag and began to hustle with purpose towards the stairwell. As he reached the clanging of the tardy bell filled the otherwise empty hallway. Teachers lifted doorstops and gave him reproving looks as Danny shuffled to class. Danny imagined them thinking that they were glad he wasn't in their class. Room 231. Door closed. Danny took a little breath, gripped the handle, and pulled hard. The inside of the class was silent. Everyone was looking at the door to see which kid was going to be late the first period of the first day. "Glad you could make it," said the mildly irritated voice of the teacher. "Take a seat, please." Kids whispered as Danny scanned the room for a chair. No empty seats in the rear corners. Nothing along the sides. Nothing in the back at all. "Well?" the teacher asked, interrupting Danny's search. The only seat available was in the front row on the far corner. Danny felt like he was the lone balloon at the Macy's Day Freak Parade as he crossed the class, the squishing of his shoes making an excessive amount of noise for their size. He tried to look disinterested as he dropped his bag to the floor, and for the first time since falling off the bus, he took a good look at it. The bag was drenched. Mud, gravel, and water had been splashed up all on the sides, and when he opened it, Danny found most of the contents had been soaked along one edge. The girl sitting next to him raised an eyebrow and curled her lip at the state of his things. Danny gave her a weak smile before she huffed and looked away. "Great first day, buddy," he mumbled to himself. "Great first day." Chapter 5. Things could get better, but they don't. In only his first hour of the day, Danny feared he had cemented a reputation amongst the student body of Giant Hills Middle School. First, he had taken a nosedive off a school bus, a maneuver he prayed did not end up on video. Danny couldn't imagine the horror of being the star of a new fail compilation. Then, he had slopped himself around like some swamp monster, leaving dirty trails of muddy water wherever he stepped or placed his bag. At the end of class, Danny turned to a boy behind him and joked, "So much for Dead People 101. Now it's off to burning things, followed by headaches." The boy didn't respond. He just stared at Danny, like he wasn't sure if there was going to be a zombie outbreak or a case of arson in the school or something. I don't know. At length, the boy sidestepped Danny and headed for the door. Danny could hear him talking with the girl as they left. The words freak and puddle boy could easily be heard over the noise. Second period was science, and that proved to be a continuation of his experience in history, though slightly less damp. Third period was math, and as Danny's luck would have it, the class was presided over by the teacher he had bumped into this morning. "Did you find American history all right, Danny?" she had asked while taking attendance. "Yes, ma'am," Danny had replied in a murmur. "Oh, good," the teacher responded happily. "On time, then?" "No, ma'am," he said. She made a tisking noise at him and said, "No way to start your year, young man, but I am sure you will improve." As Mrs. Dobson continued taking roll, a voice floated to Danny from behind him. It was a poor impersonation of the math teacher's. "So sorry, young man, you can't figure out how to read the numbers on the door," the voice chortled. "After a few English classes," it continued, "maybe you will be more successful." Danny turned and spied Billy, the kid who had dumped him in the water earlier. Billy scowled at Danny and barked, "What are you looking at, Puddles?" "Nothing," Danny replied, slowly turning back to the front. "Great," he thought, "I have a nickname." The class progressed, like the previous two. It was a typical first day. Attendance, introduction, syllabus, rules, handouts, a simple assignment, and then the bell. As the clock swung closer to 11:30 and the lunch hour, Danny began to consider for the first time what he would do at lunch. Yesterday, he would have said it wouldn't have mattered what he did, but now, with the moment fast approaching, Danny began to dwell on the fact that he had not put a single thought into his lunch hour, and there was not one single person who wanted to hang out with him. Not one. Last year, life was easy. Danny would joke with Richard, listen to Charlie's dumb stories, and keep Andrew from stealing French fries off his plate. Danny began to wonder what his old friends would be doing for lunch. Did they miss him? Or had they forgotten about him already and found a replacement Danny? The thought disturbed him, but he told himself he would understand if they did. He wasn't exactly feeling like anything special at the moment. All too soon the bell rang, and the class began to migrate to the cafeteria. Danny wanted to hide. He had no desire to be put on display again in front of hundreds of his peers. As he left, Danny asked Mrs. Dobson if he could sit in the office for lunch. "Sorry, Danny, but since other classes will be in session still, children are restricted to the cafeteria during the lunch hour." "How about the media center?" he asked. With the slightest suggestion of irritation flashing behind her reading glasses, the teacher replied, "No, Danny, the media center is closed up right now. You need to go to the cafeteria with the rest of the students for lunch." And with that, she scooped her things and herded Danny down the hall. Chapter 6. Almost everyone was laughing. To be blunt, the cafeteria looked like a rec room at a nut house. People were loudly scattered across the multi-purpose room, laughing and waving, calling to friends, and counting off who would sit where. You see, at his last school, the tables were fitted with benches. You could cram 14 kids at a single table if you had a motivated group. Here, the cafeteria tables were different. They had stools, 8 seats for 8 bodies. Either you were in or you were out. Danny stood a while and watched the drama unfolding around him. Kids negotiating for a seat at their preferred table, some losing and walking off to find a new table, while the victors enjoyed their new seats for the year. 8. 8. 8. All around the room, kids were filling the tables and vying to be one of 8. "Pieces of 8, Danny laughed to himself, and suddenly felt like a pirate without a ship. He stood another moment or two, looking for a seat that he could claim. One table was totally empty, but he wasn't ready to be that kid. Another was half filled, but the kids at that table looked like they would break Danny, wrap him in bread, and eat him for lunch. Another table had 1 seat left, but it would be awkward to sit there and immediately be so close to 7 other kids that he didn't even know. Then he spied the perfect spot. 2 kids, kind of normal looking, who were the only ones at a back table. Danny adjusted his bag and headed that way. Halfway across the room, though, 6 kids came over and filled the rest of the seats. Now he's standing alone in the middle of the room with nowhere to go. Danny panicked at what he feared was certain to be an embarrassing situation and sat in the closest seat he could find, alone, at the empty table. "Guess I'm ready to be that kid," he muttered as he drew lunch from his bag. "Hey, can we sit here?" Danny looked up and choked a bit on his food. Standing before him were Billy and Peter from the bus this morning, and another boy Danny didn't recognize. "Well," Billy pressed. Thanks," Peter said cheerfully, and plopped down right next to Danny. The other 2 boys sat across from Danny, like the 4 of them were old friends. Danny looked from his packed lunch to their school lunches with a little bit of envy. Burgers, fries, carrots, and a chocolate chip cookie versus his bag sandwich and some wheat crackers. Danny decided that being poor sucked. The next few minutes proved to be rather awkward for Danny, though the word was growing to be the most appropriate description of his whole day thus far. The other 3 boys chatted happily about the school, how they hated their math teacher, how cute the girls were, but they were all stuck up, and what they would do after school. All the while, though, it didn't seem to matter that Danny was there. No one asked him anything. No one said anything to him at all. In fact, Danny started to think this was some big, elaborate joke until he realized Peter was saying his name. "Huh?" Danny answered. Peter laughed and replied, "I said, do you want my cookie?" "Your cookie?" Danny asked suspiciously. "Peter hates the cookies here," Billy explained. "He gives them to everyone." Peter lifted his tray and spun it so the cookie was close to Danny. Here, just take it. Danny froze, giving furtive looks at the cookie and the giver in equal parts. Oh my God, Dan, take the cookie, Peter pressed. Dan? Danny wasn't sure if he heard right. Did Peter just call him Dan? Okay, he finally said, then scooped up the cookie and popped it in his mouth. And then the giggling began. What? Danny asked around the cookie. It's good, huh? Billy asked between laughs. Oh no. A kid from another table hollered at the boys. Did he eat it? Oh no. Yes, Peter roared. He pointed at Danny and informed the room. He just ate the toilet cookie. Danny spit out what he hadn't already swallowed, while the boys described dunking the cookie in a stall toilet, carefully dabbing the extra water, and placing the cookie back on the tray. And he ate it. Puddles ate the toilet cookie, Billy jeered. The laughter continued as conflicting emotions rose in Danny's chest. Fight? Danny didn't feel like he could ever actually fight someone with any hope of winning, so that was out. Run? Yeah, that would look great. Sprinting out of the cafeteria like a jaded princess. No, thank you. Walk away the bigger person? Oh, you mean the walk of shame? In the end, Danny just sat there, ashamed and unable to move, while the waves of ridicule crashed around him. Mercifully, a teacher walked over and started barking directions. Okay, everybody, let's get moving. The bell is about to ring, so start picking up your trash and get back to class. The students around Danny began to rise and disperse. All the while, he just sat there listening to the retelling of the incident and the calls of Puddles and the Cookie Monster mixing with giggles and laughter. Next gaping hole in the earth that I come across, Danny mused, I'm throwing myself in. As he finally stood and gathered his things, a group of stragglers caught Danny's eye. They were the typical geeks who looked like they would be more at home playing video games than talking to girls. As the four of them passed Danny, one of them muttered, Better you than me. Great, Danny thought. Even the geeks don't respect me. He stomped out of the cafeteria and marched to his next class with a purpose in his step you only get from anger. Only looking up from his feet to keep his bearings, Danny threaded the other students without seeing any of them. In a word, he had just about given up on this whole school. The next class was English, and making it with a few minutes to spare, he chose a seat by the door in order to make a quick exit. Danny hoped his teacher wasn't the kind who assigned seats on the first day. Attention, class, came the voice from behind the big desk. Please reference the chart by the door and find your assigned seat. Dang. So I can learn all your names, Danny mumbled to himself sarcastically. So I can learn all your names, the teacher said. Man, life is crap some days. My name is Mrs. Jenkins, and I will be your English teacher this year. I hope you all had a nice summer. But it's now time to get back to business. I would like for everyone to get out a sheet of paper and write 3 paragraphs about your summer. What was the best part? What was the worst part? What did you do? 3 paragraphs, no less than 5 sentences each. Danny just took a deep breath. His summer had been like a blur. He'd enjoyed going to the pool with Richard, hanging out with his friends, and enjoying his last summer residing in his old house. But that was July, and August was a lot of packing. His parents had become irritable with Danny and each other. He just chalked it up to the stress of the move. And as moving day had approached, Danny became more solemn, as if he were packing for prison. He had spent much of his time in his room, depressed about leaving his old life and nervous about having to start all over in a new school. But what would he write about? That he was mad at his parents? That he hated the school? That the best part of the summer was so grossly eclipsed by the bad that it hardly seemed to matter? That would make for joyful reading. So Danny decided to just start writing and see what came of it. He knocked out his 3 paragraphs and turned it in. Biding his time, he looked out the window and saw that the rain was still coming down pretty hard. His teacher was making small talk with one of the students and mentioned that she had heard that it would be raining for quite a while. Great, Danny thought. If my life has no chance of sunshine, why should this school be any different? He watched the droplets pound the windows and wished he was back in bed. His head fell to his desk, and Danny tried to imagine he was somewhere else. Behind him, a girl looks on, saddened by what she sees, but too nervous to say anything. Despite all of his feelings, Danny is not as alone as he feels.